The last installment of our 4 mini lectures on the topic of the mirror stage has the title of On Looking Good Naked. So that means we can pose 2 questions. The first is about a TV show. In 2006, Channel 4 in the UK had a show called How to Look Good Naked. And the premise of the show was that you would be given a bit of a makeover. The host of the show would give you some tips on how to do your hair and how to do your clothes and how to change various facets of your visual appearance, so that if there was to be a photograph of you blown up into a billboard and put in some public space in a semi-naked, semi-nude situation, you would look good naked. So what I'd like us to think a little bit about today is how might we look good naked? The second question, somewhat more serious, is concerned with the idea of solitary confinement. Some years ago, I had the experience of going to some human rights violations hearings, and one of the findings or assertions that I found surprising was that many people who'd experienced multiple different forms of torture spoke about solitary confinement as perhaps one of the worst forms of torture. Now, to a naive and never tortured person like myself, that doesn't make an awful lot of sense. I would have thought that being alone, locked up, secluded from other people would by far be preferential to some kind of brutal physical pain. But apparently solitary confinement is, for many people who've experienced it, a very brutal form of torture. So why is that? Right, we've got our 2 questions in place. Let's start to go through some of the ideas that we have mentioned. I have spoken a little bit about this psychological concept. Lacan doesn't invent the concept, he utilizes it, transitivism. This idea that in certain situations, often in the circumstances of early childhood, we have what I've considered an overextension of the boundaries of the ego. Something that happens to someone else seems to be pertinent to me, almost immediately physically experienced, even though it happens to someone else. We extrapolated on that also to make the point in our previous lecture about how the very conditions of having an ego are to be entangled with others, because others are a resource, an image, images that we use to try and understand ourselves and give some pretend sense of substantiality to ourselves. If that's the case, you could say that the very basis of identity is a kind of confusion, an imaginary confusion between me and my images, me and other people who I take as images to give me a sense of my own individuality, my own subjectivity. Now, if we've stressed this idea of transitivism, fancy name for an overextension of the parameters of the boundaries of the ego, and if we've stressed that there's always, in Lacanian theory, the prospect of this overlapping of me with my mirror image, and indeed not just overlapping, a sense of the blurriness of those divides, that what happens to others seems to in some respects also happen to me, that I'm continually projecting onto others. If we take all of that stuff seriously, then 2 interesting assertions come to the forefront. One of which is, what is happening to the other? Inasmuch as the other is an image that I'm identifying with, what is happening to the other and what the other is doing is always very, very pertinent to me. So early on in Lacan's career, his PhD thesis is an extended case study of a woman called Emmy, who is seemingly psychotically structured and who has a whole lot of paranoid ideas. This is very influential to Lacan, and he's always aware of the quality of some kind of paranoid knowledge or paranoid sensibility. One of the extrapolations that can be made from all of the ideas that we've spoken about in the mirror stage is that the very condition of knowledge for human beings entails the prospect or a kind of foundational element of paranoid understanding. Or put differently, if what happens to the other, and the other is always a resource of my own identification, then what happens to the other is always of certain pertinence to me, what they desire, what they want. Or, reformulated again, what the other says and does and what they're thinking. That can be understood at some level to be pertaining to me, inasmuch as that other is also a mirror image of myself. So one then gets a sense that one could suggest that paranoia is not only isolated to its more extreme or exaggerated forms, it is also a very part and parcel element of human subjectivity, human identification, and the underlying conditions whereby one knows and tries to know about the world. There's that lingering element of, what does this mean for me? What does this pertain to the other? What does the other desire? Why is this important to me? So I just wanted to introduce that idea and keep it out there. The other assertion that I mentioned that we need to bear in mind is, and a nice example here would be the standard Disney movie. In many Disney movies, and it's not only Disney movies, there's this, often in kids' movies, there's this underlying theme of be true to yourself, be yourself. Now, we may note that there's something of a paradox in the be yourself, because by the time we get to this mantra, this take-home message, it is often portrayed for us in the form of a narrative of what is happening to another character. So you could say it's a little bit paradoxical that the film tells us to be ourselves, if to be yourself is to copy the guy in the film who learned the lesson of being themselves. So often we have this imperative, be yourself, like I've just been myself, which seems to kind of invert upon itself, because surely being myself is not something I can do simply by copying what you've done. But through Lacan's ideas of the mirror stage, once we've taken seriously that the other is in a sense primary, that the other comes first, then one starts to appreciate how a condition of possibility for me attaining my own subjectivity might be to have made some identification, in fact, in some level must be, to have made an identification with someone else already, or an image from outside of myself already as the basis of becoming of myself. So that paradox where we're told to be yourself by being like a great sports personality or whatever, although it is a paradox, it kind of also makes sense in terms of Lacanian theory, where the other was always me before I got to being me. The other is more somehow better at being I than I myself am. This then leads us, got a whole basic series of assertions in place now to foreground what I think is a really crucial, really big concept within all of this theory and thinking on the mirror stage. And that's the notion of meconnaissance. Meconnaissance, French term, means different people want to translate it in slightly different ways, but we can think of it, to keep things basic, as misrecognition. But the crucial caveat here is this is not just a misrecognition. Because if we think about meconnaissance as misrecognition, then it sounds like it's within the domain of error, it's within the domain of a falsity, a mistake that I make that I can easily correct. It's not really that kind of misrecognition. It helps, in fact, to maybe think about it like this, misrecognition, whereas the emphasis is on recognition itself. An example, those moments when in some kind of intersubjective exchange, you attempted to say, I know exactly how you feel. The same thing has happened to me. That's how I feel about it. Those moments when we have a kind of imaginary recognition, that kind of eureka moment where I really get it, I really understand what you're saying. Those moments, precisely those moments that we would underline and emphasize as moments of subjective recognition, those for Lacan are always precisely the moments of misrecognition, whereby via this rush to understand, this rush to give identity to give meaning to appreciate in my own ego terms, I've actually missed an opportunity to understand something. I would rather desperately have an image, an identity, an understanding, a meaning. So those moments, and to reiterate, bearing in mind that one is occupying the position of one's ego in those moments, it's precisely when you think you've best understood something, precisely when you have that ego resonance of, me too, I really understand that. For Lacan, those are moments of meconnaissance, of misrecognition, of taking an image from the outside and thinking that one has understood it. The clinical imperative that comes from that is maybe, you could almost say the learning imperative that comes from that, is that it's precisely at those moments where one could ask, what are you not grasping here? What have you not seen? What have you not understood? In what way have you taken what someone else has said and assimilated it to the parameters of your own ego understanding? And that's why those moments of recognition are constantly and routinely, essentially, moments of misrecognition for Lacan. Now, here's a little bridge to what we'll start to talk about in lectures to come. And the bridge is to say why I've emphasized meconnaissance and misrecognition as the very basis of understanding, as the very basis of identity, as the very basis of meaning, is that this is a crucial concept to many elements of Lacanian psychoanalytic clinical practice, where the clinician is not going to try to enable understandings or insights or breakthrough aha moments. Those aren't the direction of the clinical practice of Lacanian psychoanalysis. Precisely because, as we've tried to illustrate in previous lectures, the ego is a fictitious, or is located in a fictitious direction, that it's so eager to consolidate itself with various images, with various illusions, with various meanings, that it doesn't pay any attention or enough attention to all those points of fracture and fragmentation. So you could say that one of the reasons I'm signaling the importance of meconnaissance is a concept that becomes a fulcrum for a whole series of directives within Lacanian clinical practice. But that's a topic that we'll move on to. This question here, image as mediator. I wanted to just stress this again because in lecture 3 I said that there's an automatic mismatch or disjuncture between the imaginary image of one's body on the one hand and the real of unmediated bodily experience. Or we can replay that and say that there's an automatic mismatch between the imaginary image or the imaginary coherence of one's ego and the real of unmediated psychical experience. That sounds a little bit like there's too many words there. It sounds a little bit complicated maybe, but the reason I'm trying to stress that, and you'll see I've made an opposition here between imaginary and real, is that the image is a kind of mediation. The image is a kind of domestication. The image is a way of giving a form, an image, a meaning to a type of experience. In that respect, we can only say thank goodness for images because they enable us to precisely domesticate, to stabilize, to maybe give fixity to a type of experience, which is presumably a good thing, but only up until a point, because sometimes that fixity, that cohesion of the image limits our ability to shift and think or conceptualize or open up that real of experience. One last point is to stress about that. By using those two terms, imaginary and real, I'm trying to prepare the ground for when we do a more rigorous, considered differentiation between these three crucial Lacanian concepts. The three registers of psychical reality, as constantly stressed by Lacanians. Imaginary, that is the domain of egoic identifications, meanings, of cohesion, of closure, of understanding, precisely as epitomized in the operations of the mirror stage. The domain of the symbolic, which is the domain of language, the domain of prohibitions, of laws, of structure, and finally the domain of the real, which here seems to mean something like unmediated bodily experience. The real is that which has not yet been mediated by an image that makes it more understandable, that gives it a picture, that gives it some kind of structure. Precisely that remains unmediated also by the symbolic. But that too is something that we'll get to. Let's then start to work to a little bit of a conclusion by asking, what is it that gets focused on in the mirror image? Because you could say, well, I'm little Johnny, I'm a little infant, freshly born Johnny, my mom keeps on propping me up against the mirror and I'm like, enough already, mom. You could argue, okay, even if we buy all this mirror stage stuff, why identify with? Why should the eureka moment happen with the image or with my eyes? Why shouldn't it be with something in the background? Or why should it not be with my feet or my nose as opposed to my ears or whatever it is? It's a good question. Of course, we could think about how to answer it in a number of ways. But the reason I'm stressing it in this way is that this is not only a theory about the imaginary realm. We've stressed in multiple ways that it's a lot to do with the imaginary realm, but it's also in part to do with the symbolic realm, the realm of signifiers, words, symbolic values. So when people teach the mirror stage, they invariably have this moment and they say, well, little Johnny is propped up when he's shown to the mirror because he's all over the place, right? He's a little bit of a ragdoll kid at the beginning of his life. So someone needs to like hold up his head, and presumably that engagement with the mirror image is one that's accompanied by words. Oh, what a lovely smile you've got, you little guy, or whatever it is. So what that suggests then is that the engagement with the mirror image is not without its symbolic qualities. There's someone there, some significant other, who's directing the child's attention to a facet of their image, or even if it's not to the actual particularities of certain physical features, which it often is, it's to a facet of the image, that facet of the image that is their reflection. So it's important just to bear in mind that targeting of the image, that focusing, that symbolic focusing. And this takes us back to how to look good naked. The whole premise of how to look good naked is that you would say, but hold on, why do I need a makeover show to look good naked? Presumably the relationship between me and my mirror image is my own private relationship, right? It's me, mirror, me, the image of myself in the mirror. Maybe I want to comb my hair in that way and look good. But of course, the whole premise of how to look good naked is that I need to look good naked for an other, the public. That's why in the show, you got to have your billboard picture put up somewhere, or it's got to be in a storefront window or something. So the point is actually a fairly straightforward one. My relationship to my mirror image is an imaginary dyadic relationship, me, image, take on image as a basis of identification. But it's actually not merely dyadic. It's not just 2 points. There's always that lens of how the other sees my image. So to look good naked, it's always a question of, well, you know, how does the host of the show think this looks good? So even in the most personal, private, intimate engagement with one's own image, that's always mediated by a third, by a figure of the other. And in How to Look Good Naked, maybe it's the public generally, or maybe it's epitomized by the host of the show who kind of leads you through the makeover process. So what's the point here? The point is to say that even this imaginary dialectic, if you want to call it that exchange between subject and their image, it's always mediated by a symbolic element. And that symbolic element is something that we'll go on to talk about in some subsequent lectures. We've got 2 more points to make before we wrap up. One of them is, who or what does the misrecognizing in the first place? In my life, I've been to a lot of boring, dare I say it, Lacan lectures. And one lecture that wasn't boring was someone said in a session where the mirror stage was being discussed, came up with a great question, and they said, you've given us this whole mirror stage theory. The mirror stage is supposed to account for how the ego emerges. The mirror stage tells us that the ego emerges from the taking of an image from the outside. But if the ego only emerges by the taking on of an image from the outside, then we have a logical problem. Because who or what is it that does the misrecognition of the image to take it on in the first place? You've got a theory of how an ego emerges, which seems to beg the question of what was there, or implies that there was a kind of quasi-ego already there to do the recognizing. How does that work? Well, there's a bunch of ways we can try and answer that question. But what I want to stress here is that, a couple of things. Number one, we could be more precise. When Lacan is doing the mirror stage thinking, he also wants to suggest that we need to think about the ideal ego. The ideal ego is precisely that facet of the ego which is taking on idealizing images. That's the narcissistic component of the ego that is taking on images from the outside world to give it an ideal image of itself. I stress that because once again in later lectures we'll start to make a distinction between ideal ego and ego ideal. 2 concepts that are named very similarly but have an important distinction. The other reason that I wanted to make mention of this is that we've already set in place an idea that there's a distinction between an imaginary and a real domain of experience. So one way of answering the question is that there's the very process whereby which this individual starts to take on images from the outside and starts to develop an increasingly complex, layered, ideal ego is a process which begs something that exists before that ideal ego. And what could we call that? Maybe we would call that the real individual, the real subject, the subject that is more, in a way, organism than ego, but that is part and parcel of the making of an ego, an ideal ego, via the taking on of those images. In other words, two things are important here. One is that the ideal ego may not be all of what is circumscribed and thought of as an ego for Lacan. And secondly, that there is something prior to an ideal ego, an organism, a real of the subject that becomes increasingly more egoic via the processes of the mirror stage. The other point to stress with that is it maybe then benefits us not to stress the ego or even the ideal ego as a thing, but more as a process, right? There are moments when Lacan is going to say the ego is a kind of imaginary object. We get that. It's a mirage. It's a kind of image. But I think it's important to think about the I function. And as this human subject who becomes increasingly able and entrapped within the dynamics of this I function, Lacan will increasingly move away from wanting to see the realm of human psychical activity as a realm of objects and rather one of processes. So let us, I think, talk more about ego as imaginary operation than ego as object, ego as thing. Back then to the question we began with. Why is solitary confinement considered to be a torture by so many people? The reason I think we could say that solitary confinement is considered a form of torture for many people is that you could say, precisely on the basis of the theory that we've discussed, that we're constantly in a certain kind of imaginary negotiation with images, with others, who are, in a sense, image resources for us to come up with a sense of an ego, with a sense of an I, with a sense of a self, with a sense of substantiality. If you were to systematically rob us of those images, of those photographs, of those pictures, think back also to the idea of your life streams, flashes before your eyes before you die. That gives us a nice way of thinking about the imaginary resources of an identity, an identification. If you have to systematically take that away from someone, no photographs, no images, no mirrors, no others, you could say that what you're effectively doing is depriving that person of a sense of their I function, because they don't have those external props, those resources of an identification, of an ego. And I think it's on that basis that we could make the argument in Lacanian terms that solitary confinement is indeed a form of torture, because what it seems to amount to is that it impoverishes the very basis through which a human subject can have a sense of an I. And if that's not a kind of impoverishing torture, then I'm not sure I know exactly what is.